Imagine standing in the Roman countryside. The fields are bare, the earth frozen, the sky heavy with dark clouds. The wind cuts like a blade, slipping through your cloak, numbing your hands. There are no central heating systems, no thick glass windows, no supermarkets stocked with food. Winter in ancient Rome wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a fight for survival. We often picture Rome as a land of marble cities, roaring arenas and bustling markets. But for the majority of Romans, the peasants, winter was something else entirely. Their lives weren't defined by gladiator battles or Senate speeches. Their lives were defined by whether they had enough firewood, enough cloaks, enough grain stored to survive until spring. And yet, somehow, they endured. With simple tools, fragile homes, and the barest scraps of food, these men and women fought back against cold and hunger. Their survival shaped the empire itself. Because without the peasants, Rome's fields would be empty, its legions unfed, its empire undone. But beyond the snow and silence lay darker truths. On the coldest nights, survival pushed peasants to the very edge of humanity, to choices so desperate that history rarely speaks of them. In this journey, we'll step into their world, from the biting winds of Roman winters, to the smoky huts where families huddled, to the hidden rituals that kept hope alive. And finally, we'll uncover what really happened on those coldest nights, the nights that tested the limits of human endurance. And to truly understand their struggle, we must begin where winter itself began, with the land, the climate, and the icy breath that swept across the Roman world. For peasants living in the countryside, the cold months stripped away comfort, leaving only the raw question of survival. The climate of the Roman Empire was diverse, stretching across 3 continents. But in the Italian heartland, winters were harsh enough to threaten life. Frost blanketed the fields, rivers froze, and daylight hours shrank. For farmers and peasants, the rhythms of the seasons controlled everything, and winter was a time when nature turned against them. Unlike modern winters cushioned by heating, insulation, and stocked supermarkets, the Roman peasant had almost nothing. No glass panes protected homes from the icy wind. No thick coats wrapped their bodies. Survival meant enduring cold with the most basic tools. For many, the first frost was a reminder of the months to come. It meant that the harvest was over. The work of summer and autumn, cutting, storing, and preserving food, had to sustain them. A mistake in storage, a poor harvest, or an early frost meant empty stomachs in February. Hunger was not a rare visitor. It was a constant shadow. The Roman world also lacked many of the modern medical comforts we take for granted. A simple fever could turn fatal when combined with cold and malnutrition. For children and the elderly, winter was especially deadly. Yet winter also structured peasant life in other ways. Work in the fields slowed, but the struggle indoors intensified. Families turned inward, gathering around fires, conserving energy and rationing food. It was a season of silence and endurance. The elite in Rome wrote about winter as something picturesque. Frost on the fields, crisp air, evenings by the hearth. But the peasants lived its harsh reality. For them, winter was no poetic backdrop. It was a force that could take lives, and when the frost crept closer, the first line of defense was not armor or walls, but the peasant's own home. How well, or how poorly, that home was built often meant the difference between endurance and tragedy. Most peasants lived in simple, wattle and daub huts, walls made of mud and straw, roofs thatched with reeds. They offered shelter, but little insulation. Gaps in the walls let in drafts. When the wind howled, it found every crack. The hearth was the heart of the home. A shallow fire pit burned in the center, filling the room with heat and smoke. Without chimneys, huts were thick with fumes, stinging eyes and lungs. Yet families endured the smoke because the fire was life itself. Without it, frost crept in. Wood was precious. Gathering it was exhausting, especially in freezing weather. But without a steady supply, the fire would die. Some families supplemented wood with dried animal dung, burning anything that could sustain flame. At night, the fire was carefully banked, covered with ash to keep embers alive until morning. Children might be tasked with feeding the fire through the night, for letting it go out could mean hours of shivering in darkness, scrambling to relight it. To keep warmth in, people and animals shared space. Goats, sheep, even chickens were brought inside the hut during the worst nights. Their breath and bodies added warmth, though they also brought fleas, noise, and stench. Even with these efforts, nights were brutal. Blankets were rare. Cloaks doubled as bedding. Families huddled close, layering straw beneath them to keep the cold from the floor. For the wealthy, winter meant roaring hearths and thick-walled villas. For peasants, it meant smoky rooms, thin walls, and constant vigilance to keep the fire alive. Shelter wasn't comfort. It was a fragile barrier against death, but even the thickest walls and longest burning fires could not shield a peasant once they stepped outside. Survival demanded a second line of defense, the clothes on their backs. A Roman peasant's wardrobe was not built for luxury. It was built for survival. And in winter, every scrap of cloth became a weapon against the cold. The basic garment was the tunica, a simple woolen tunic worn by both men and women. In summer, it was light and airy. In winter, peasants layered it, adding whatever they could to trap warmth. Wool was the most common fabric, scratchy, heavy, but durable. Over the tunic came the sagum, a thick woolen cloak. Unlike the elegant togas of the elite, the sagum was practical, clasped at the shoulder, and often doubled as a blanket at night. Many peasants owned only one cloak, and it had to serve them in field and bed alike. Shoes were another challenge. Peasants wore simple leather sandals or hobnailed boots. In winter, they stuffed them with wool, cloth, or even straw to fight frostbite. Wet shoes meant danger. A long day in frozen fields could cripple toes. Children often fared worst. Clothing was handed down until it fell apart, leaving the youngest in rags. A child in winter might wear garments patched dozens of times, with skin peeking through the holes. Protection also came from animal skins. A sheepskin worn over the shoulders could mean survival in a snowstorm. But hides were valuable, and peasants often sold them for coin, leaving themselves with less protection. Head coverings were rare, but useful. Some tied cloth around their heads, others wore simple felt caps. Anything to keep body heat from escaping was treasured. Unlike the wealthy, peasants had no wardrobes to choose from. They wore what they had until it wore out, then patched it until it could be patched no more. Winter clothing was a patchwork of necessity, not fashion. But warmth alone could not keep life burning. Even wrapped in cloaks beside the fire, a family could not outlast the winter unless their stomachs were full. And so, survival turned to the question of food, what was stored and what was left. The backbone of the peasant diet was grain, wheat, barley, or spelt, depending on the region. After harvest, families stored sacks of grain in clay jars or underground pits lined with straw. These stores were guarded carefully. Grain could be ground into flour for flatbreads or boiled into porridge, a filling meal that stretched far. A peasant family measured grain not by abundance but by survival. Do we have enough to reach March? Alongside grain came legumes, beans, lentils, and peas. These were dried after harvest and lasted through the winter, offering much-needed protein. Salted pork or dried fish might be added if a family was lucky, but meat was rare for peasants. More often, meat was saved for festivals, or eaten only when an animal died unexpectedly. Preservation was key. Meat could be salted or smoked. Vegetables might be pickled or stored in cool cellars. Olive oil was precious, not only for cooking but for calories. Even wine had its role. Watered down, it provided safe drinking liquid and some warmth on cold nights. Hunger was never far away. A harsh winter could empty jars by January. A poor harvest year meant famine. Roman writers record villages struck by hunger where people boiled roots or bark, anything to fill the stomach. Disease followed close behind. For a weakened body stood little chance against cold and sickness. The daily rhythm of winter food was simple but monotonous. Bread, porridge, beans. A mother might stretch one loaf to feed her entire family, breaking it into small pieces, dipping it in oil, and handing it out like treasure. Children learned not to complain about hunger. Everyone was hungry. Food was also shared in community rituals. During Saturnalia, neighbors sometimes pooled resources for a small feast, giving families one bright memory in a bleak season. Yet once the festival ended, reality returned. Thin meals, careful rationing, and the constant fear of running out. For the wealthy, winter was a time of roasted meats, imported fruits, and endless wine. For peasants, it was about stretching grain, scraping jars, and praying the stores would last until the first shoots of spring. In the end, food was not about flavor. It was about survival. Every bite eaten in winter was one step closer to spring. More day won in the silent battle against hunger and frost. Yet even the fullest granary could not carry a family through winter without the strength of others. Survival was never a solitary fight. It was woven into the bonds of family and the lifeline of the community. Life in the countryside was built on family and community, and in the coldest months, survival depended on both. Inside a hut, families huddled together for warmth. Parents slept beside children, wrapping themselves in the same cloak or blanket. The body heat of 5 people pressed shoulder to shoulder could mean the difference between shivering all night and finding a little rest. Beds were made of straw stuffed into sacks, often damp and crawling with fleas, but still better than the frozen ground. Keeping the fire alive was everyone's responsibility. A father might split firewood by day while children gathered twigs and brush. At night, family members took turns watching the embers, feeding them just enough fuel to last until morning. Letting the fire go out was unthinkable. Relighting it in the middle of the night meant fumbling in the cold and wasting precious wood. Beyond the household, neighbors also mattered. Villages often shared resources when times grew hard. If one family ran out of food, another might spare a loaf. If a roof collapsed under heavy snow, neighbors would help patch it. The poorest peasants relied on this web of support. Without it, they faced starvation or exposure. Even animals were part of the survival circle. Peasants brought goats, sheep, and chickens indoors, letting their warmth mingle with the families. The smell was terrible, but no one complained. The animals were life itself, giving milk, eggs, and heat. Children were not shielded from hardship. From a young age, they learned that survival was a shared duty. A boy might be tasked with keeping the fire alive while his father slept. A girl might spin wool by lamplight to patch torn cloaks. Childhood ended quickly in winter. Togetherness was more than practical. It was psychological. Long, dark nights were easier to endure when you weren't alone. In the laughter of neighbors during Saturnalia, in the songs sung around a shared fire, there was a reminder that even in the coldest season, people could cling to each other and to hope. But for Roman peasants, survival in winter wasn't just physical, it was also spiritual. When the nights grew long and food ran low, faith became another kind of fire, offering light in the darkness. Every home, no matter how poor, had a place for the lares and penates, the household gods who guarded the family in the storeroom. Small clay or wooden figures stood in corners or niches, often beside the hearth. Each evening offerings were made, a crust of bread, a splash of wine, or a pinch of grain. These sacrifices were small but meaningful. To peasants, neglecting the household gods was dangerous. A cold night could be endured, but only if the gods watched over the home. The changing of the year also brought festivals, the most famous being Saturnalia, held in December. For peasants, it was more than a festival of feasting and games. It was a psychological shield against despair. Families who had been rationing their grain might loosen their restrictions for a few days, baking extra bread, roasting a piece of meat if they could spare it. Neighbors gathered, laughter replaced silence, and even the harshest winter felt a little brighter. In the countryside, older traditions lingered. Some peasants whispered prayers to local spirits of fields and rivers, hoping for mercy until spring returned. Others tied charms of wool or clay to doorways to keep evil at bay during the longest nights. Religion gave meaning to the suffering. A poor harvest wasn't just bad luck. It might be a sign of divine displeasure. A sudden thaw could be seen as a blessing from Saturn or Ceres. These beliefs gave peasants hope, and hope was as necessary as bread. On the coldest nights, when the fire burned low and children whimpered under thin blankets, peasants prayed. They prayed for the sun to rise, for their animals to survive, for their grain jars not to empty before the first shoots of spring. And in those whispered prayers, they found the strength to endure another day. But prayers and rituals could only carry them so far. When the fire went out, when the food was gone, and when the night grew colder than hope itself, peasants faced the true test of winter. These were the deadliest nights, the nights that stripped survival down to its rawest edge. These were the nights when fires died, bellies ached with hunger, and even faith could not shield the poor from despair. For peasants, the fire was life itself. If the hearth went out in the middle of the night, relighting it meant fumbling in the freezing dark, wasting precious wood. Families huddled together under thin cloaks, praying the embers would last until dawn. Infants and the elderly were most at risk. Many did not survive until morning. Hunger sharpened the danger. When food stores ran low by January or February, families watered down porridge to stretch it further. Children went to sleep on empty stomachs, their parents pretending they had eaten more than they had. Roman writers describe peasants boiling bark or roots to quiet hunger. In the worst winters, famine struck, and with it came terrifying rumors of cannibalism in remote villages, whispered as warnings of how far desperation could drive the human spirit. Disease also haunted the coldest nights. Damp huts and crowded sleeping arrangements spread fevers and coughs like wildfire. A simple chill could turn fatal, and there were no doctors for the poor. A cough heard in the night often meant a funeral by morning. Animals, too, were pulled into the struggle. Goats and sheep were brought inside not only for warmth, but for survival. If a goat died of cold, the family lost both heat and milk. The bond between humans and animals was so close that their fates became one. And yet, through all this, most peasants endured. They clung to each other, to their gods, to the faint hope that dawn would break. Each coldest night was a silent war against hunger, frost, and despair. And victory meant simply surviving until sunrise. The Roman Empire is remembered for its emperors, its armies, its marble monuments. But the empire did not survive on stone and steel alone. It survived on the backs of ordinary people, peasants who faced the coldest winters with almost nothing, yet somehow endured. Through our journey, we've seen how these families braved the season, huddling in smoky huts, keeping fires alive through the night, wrapping themselves in patched cloaks, stretching every handful of grain, and leaning on one another for warmth and hope. We've seen how religion offered comfort, how festivals like Saturnalia gave brief moments of joy, and how even the humblest offerings to the household gods carried the weight of survival. But we've also uncovered the darker truth, that on the coldest nights, survival sometimes meant desperation, hunger, and loss. Infants were claimed by the frost, elders faded in the night, and in famine years, entire villages felt the hand of death. These were not the stories carved in marble or written in triumphal inscriptions. They were the silent struggles of the forgotten millions who kept Rome alive, and yet despite it all, they endured. They tilled the frozen fields, prayed for spring, and clung to life with a resilience that is easy to overlook but impossible to dismiss. Their survival was not glorious, but it was essential. Without them, there would be no empire to remember. So the next time you picture Rome, don't just see the shining Colosseum or the victorious legions. See the peasant family huddled by their fire, whispering prayers into the night, waiting for dawn. Because in their survival, through winter's cruelty, lies the true strength of Rome.